Hello all and welcome. My name is Margaret. I'm a historical costumer and textile conservator in training, and today I have another wonderful sewing video for you. Since it was the dead of winter and I had gone home to Minnesota, I'm now back in my wonderful apartment, I was inspired by the winter weather to make an 18th century red wool cloak. Now these are iconic in the historical costuming world because they were an essential piece of outerwear for men, women, and children throughout the second half of the 18th century and into the first half of the 19th century. Often called cardinals, these red wool cloaks were extremely popular, although they did come in a variety of other colors. There were short cloaks that came to just below the elbow and then various lengths all the way to the ground. There were variations for men and women, but I'm going to make a traditional sort of women's style cloak with the nice big hood for that 18th century hair, and I'm going to be using the colonial Williamsburg pattern in the book Costume Close Up. Now these cloaks were super popular and they were worn by almost every class of society, although they were particularly popular with the rural, sort of middle and lower classes when you get into the 19th century, especially in England. They were also often sold as ready-made garments, which is particularly interesting in the 18th century because that doesn't happen very often. Obviously with a cloak there's not a lot of fitting involved, so that does make sense. They were often made out of wool broadcloth, which is amazing because it sews up really quick. You don't have to have any seam finishing or any hem finishing because it doesn't fray, which makes this project went by really fast, which was amazing. Now, because widths of fabric in the 18th century were narrow, in order to get sort of this half circle shape you need for a cloak, things were often pieced together in various ways. This is also true of my cloak. However, my fabric was like 5 inches, I think, wider than the original, so I did use that to my advantage, adding a couple inches onto the length of the cloak as well to make it, where I wanted to hit on me. The hoods were created from another sort of trapezoidal piece of fabric, which was then gathered at the back, again with no finishing, and then often lined. I'm gonna have my cloak just be plain and tie with a ribbon, but oftentimes these cloaks were also trimmed with fur or different sorts of soutache or whatever you'd like. It was a brave world out there. You could trim your cloak with whatever you would enjoy. Often these cloaks were lined with silk, either in black, red, or white. I'm going to use white for mine, so very exciting. That's what the original in the Colonial Williamsburg book had as well. So in particular for my project, since I am using the Colonial Williamsburg cloak, there were alterations made to it in the 19th century, which is actually pretty common with these garments and pretty common with all 18th century garments, to be honest with you. So I'm going to be using the conjectures that the curator has for what it would have looked like in the 18th century particularly. If you have the book and read it, it's pretty obvious what you need to do in order to make that happen. Now, in terms of my project, I was intensely inspired to do this because of the wonderful Jane Austen adaptations that I've been watching, particularly Emma 2020 and Pride and Prejudice from 1995. Both have these red cloaks wonderfully displayed throughout the movies. I like to live and small and singing merrily upon land. And I was like, I need one of these. I just need one of these. So I'm going to make this cloak, and then I'm also going to make a Regency dress to go along with it. This is my first Regency dress I'm ever going to make, and I'm very excited to see how it turns out. So let's get sewing! This cloak is cut from 4 main pieces: the body right, left, center, and then the hood. The book noted that the original was made from 2.75 yards of 55-inch wide fabric, and I ended up using 3 yards of 60-inch wide fabric, which worked perfectly when I added the length I needed for my height. I did the math of scaling up the pieces, adding 5 inches on the end, and cut it out from there. I didn't really need a pattern because these were simple shapes and I didn't want to waste all that paper, but I did use some chalk to draw the curve and pins to mark where I was going to cut. At this point, I also clipped the arm slits into the body of the cloak. I put these a little bit too close together, but in the end, it didn't really make that much of a difference. I found this lovely wool red broadcloth at a local fabric store in my hometown of Minneapolis, and it was just screaming to be made into a cloak like this, so I had to pick it up. It's also a very good deal. Next, it was time to start sewing. I used a yellow, heavier weight silk thread. The original pattern noted that the thread was gold, like a golden brown, but I had this yellow heavyweight silk thread lying around, so I thought I would use it up instead of buying something new. I started by sewing the long seams of the cloak with just running back stitches, and since the broadcloth doesn't fray, no seam finishing was needed. I then sewed the piecing onto the hood. There wasn't quite enough space to cut this all in one piece, but if I did do this again, I would omit the piecing and just had a smaller hood, since the piecing was quite small and the fabric was thick, and this made the process of sewing up the hood quite annoying because you had to sew over all that rumply-bumply seamage. And honestly, it added like maybe an inch of extra width, which isn't necessarily the most important thing. I then sewed the two halves of the hood together. I then laid out the sewn and pressed hood to the white silk lining and then cut the lining out. At this point, I also cut out the silk facing for the center front of the cloak and set that aside. That was just like 8-inch strips of silk, not very interesting to look at. I then sewed the center back neck seam of the hood, and this is where that piecing got in the way. Just used the same running back stitches, and then I gathered up the crown of the hood with long gathering stitches. It is very important to note here that these stitches should be almost 1 inch in length because the wool makes quite thick gathers, so you really can't do any sort of, small gathering. It's just not going to work out for you. Then gather the back neck edge of the hood and attach that to the body of the cloak, of course with the same running back stitch. And then I sewed on black silk ribbons, which I think gives this cloak a fun sort of gothic touch. I then attached the facings. I took the time to make sure the facings were smoothly pinned to the fabric so no bubbling would occur either in the facing or the wool outer of the final product, and I was successful, which was amazing. I turned under the edges of the silk but kept the edges of the wool raw because folding in the wool would have created too thick of an edge. And then I whipped all that into place. I then repeated the construction steps of the hood on the lining and then pinned that into place. This was by far the most finicky and frustrating part of the project. For some reason, it just didn't quite want to line upright, probably because of the differentiation in stretch between the lining and the wool. The wool does have quite a bit of give to it, and the lining just did not. It's a plain woven silk taffeta that has no give. I then whipped that all into place, and then the process was complete. This make was relatively quick and easy, and I have to say I am in love with the final product. So thank you for watching this making of this wonderful cloak from the Colonial Williamsburg book. I'm very happy with the result. It's very beautiful. I had to come out here. This is like the only snowstorm we are going to get this year, and it's a little awkward because I'm in a park and there are an occasional person walking by, but we're dealing with it. We're doing this by ourselves today. So thank you for watching. I love this piece. I'm going to be making a Regency style dress to go along with it. So come along for that. If you would like to come along for that, you can hit the subscribe button, which is down below. You can hit the like button if you indeed like this video. And you can go follow me on TikTok and Instagram, both at Costume and Conservation. And you can also check out my new website at costumeandconservation.com. There is some pages that are locked in there just because of grad school situations right now, but hopefully that will be open to the public in the next coming years, so you can go check that out if you would like. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic day and you stay warm. Bye!